Good afternoon. What a good-looking crowd. I wasn't talking to you. No, I've got new glasses on the way. They should be in this week, next week maybe. Huh? Well, it came in, and where is it? There it is. It came in, and yeah, it got here, so I'm excited. A couple of announcements as we begin. In your bulletin, let's see, we have Coffee in the Country for the ladies Saturday morning at Julie Porter's at 9:30. And ladies get together here at the building Monday evening at 6:30. 6:30. And singing at the Jeff and Julie Porter's house next Friday at 7. And then some One Circles will meet a week from Sunday, so be checking with your group leaders about that. Carol Weedle has been in the hospital. Is she still in the hospital? Doing well? Not real well, but she's there. Okay. Any other health updates or announcements? Okay. Mandy's sister and her husband, Saturday, planning on around 1 o'clock to unload some stuff. What? 336 South Augustus. 336 South Augustus? I don't know what. West side of town. Okay. Straight south of Five Loaves. Okay. Gotcha. All right, I have to think which way south is. Okay. So 1 o'clock Saturday to help unload as they move to town. We're excited for them to be moving here. If you didn't notice, someone's sitting with us on our pew, and James and Marie are here. They will be leaving tomorrow. I'm taking them to the airport as they start their month-long trip to Argentina, and look at, they'll be obviously doing some work while they're there, but also kind of scouting out the possibility of making that a more permanent place after they get married. So let's remember them in our prayers as well. Any other announcements? Okay.
Number 382. 382, why did my Savior come to earth? Why did my Savior come to earth and to the humble road? Why did he choose a lowly birth? Because he loved me so. He loved me
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your love and your guidance and your forgiveness and your grace. Dear Lord, we thank you for being able to be here tonight to study your word. Be with the teachers that are here. Bless them for their preparation and their desire to teach your word to others. Dear Lord, help us to open our hearts and minds to your word so that we can grow in our faith. Thank you for allowing us to be with fellow Christians without having to worry. Dear Lord, we know that there are those around the world that are in danger just trying to meet. Dear Lord, bless them and care for them and help us to do what we can to spread your word wherever we go. This we pray through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Okay, let's try all this here. Feels very official or something as I get all this stuff together. I need the clicker. Okay, Daniel chapter 8. We kind of rushed to the end of Daniel chapter 7 last week and got it finished. We'll call it finished. And then I ignored Chuck's last question. And I'll continue to ignore that one until we get to a future chapter when that one will come up again. So if you remember Chuck's question, shh, be quiet and hold on to it until we get to it's chapter 9 or 10. I can't remember. Coming up, we'll get to that one again. So, for today, we're in chapter 8. What happened in chapter 7? Daniel had a vision, a dream, a nightmare, a something, and which is different because it's usually been somebody else having the dreams or the visions and Daniel interpreting them. And so this time it was Daniel having the dream, and then he had to rely on kind of the heavenly vision to interpret itself. And I don't think I've ever even really thought about kind of that aspect of it. It's like before Daniel didn't see the vision, but he got the interpretation. This time he saw the vision, but had to rely on divine interpretation for that so that he could understand what it meant, which would have been probably disorienting. So what do you think is going to happen today? Chapter 8. Daniel gets round 2 of the vision. And so we're going to see Daniel becoming more and more involved in these stories. They become more and more reliant upon him. So we're going to jump right in, and we'll do just verses 1 and 2 to kind of get oriented into the chapter and see what's going on. I am turned on. Okay. All right. Making sure. Okay. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. So when and where did the events of chapter 8 take place? The 3rd year of Belshazzar. So we've talked already about when have we seen Belshazzar. Chapter 5, we saw Belshazzar. He was the one that saw the handwriting on the wall and the meeny tickle you farson thing, and that was the last night of his reign. And so now already we've gone back in time twice. We went back to the 1st year of Belshazzar in chapter 7 and saw Daniel's vision there. So that chronologically, the events of chapter 7 precede chapter 5, and chapter 7 also precedes chapter 6, because chapter 6 is after Belshazzar's death. So now we have chapter 8 that also precedes chapter 5 and 6, but comes after chapter 7 chronologically. So if you're making a timeline of Daniel, things are jumbled if you're doing it chronologically. But if we do it thematically, or we do it sort of by order of the events that matter towards the prophecy of Daniel, then the order makes total sense. But if we're doing things just from the standpoint of the way we usually tell history, which is from start to finish, then it feels out of order for us when we realize the way things are arranged in Daniel. And where is Daniel? Okay, so he finds himself in the vision in a place in Susa, in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and there he is beside the Ulai Canal. So is he really there? Yeah, because he sees himself there, and he is not there. He's serving in Belshazzar's reign, even though Belshazzar, we find out later, doesn't really know who Daniel is, or doesn't quite understand who he is, at least. Daniel is part of Belshazzar's whatever entourage, and so Daniel is not actually in this place. In fact, we don't know that he ever did go to this place. It's possible. He's been a dignitary in this system for 50 plus years at this point, and so it's possible, as an official emissary of Nebuchadnezzar or one of the other kings, that it may be that Daniel at some point was sent there. But we don't know that for sure. And so the only thing that we do know is Daniel sees himself there, and he knows where there is. He understands what that location is. And so what is that location? It'd be the capital of Persia. Yeah, it's the capital of the Persian Empire, which is not yet an empire, because we're still under Babylon, right? Because Belshazzar is still king, so Babylon is still the empire, but there would have been provinces. Obviously, Elam was the province, and each kind of territorial province would have had their headquarters or their capital where their territorial rulers presided. And so the province of Persia was represented by the capital city of Susa. And it's interesting, one commentator said that every mention of Susa in the Bible, which sometimes in some versions it may say Shushan, but it's Susa, it's always mentioned as a citadel. It's always mentioned as a fortress. And so historically that's established. It's uncovered. There was a fortress there in this location. And so the Bible has that right. The Ulai Canal, we might think of it as a moat that went around that fortress. And so Daniel sees himself standing there next to the canal that encompasses that fortress portion of the city of Susa. So that's where he is. That's when this all is taking place. Kind of sets the stage and puts it historically for within the context of the other stuff that we've been studying. Okay, verses 3 and 4. Well, as we get into this, there's the first part of the chapter, and then there's the last part of the chapter that kind of gives some of the interpretation, that gives the interpretation after Daniel starts asking questions. We're probably going to talk a lot about the interpretation as we read through the chapter, and then when we get to the end of the chapter in about 3 weeks, it'll feel like we've already discussed all this stuff. It's because we have. We're gonna kind of take it as it comes and discuss the interpretation as we read the dream itself, or the vision itself. So verses 3 and 4. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. So, what does Daniel see? Sees a ram, and what does that ram represent? Medes and the Persians. Okay, and so if you'll think back to the last dream, chapter 7, Daniel saw 4 beasts, right? And the first beast was the lion that represented the Babylonian Empire. Then he saw, let's see, what was the next one? A bear that represented the Medes and Persians. Then he saw a leopard, and then he saw a beast. We didn't even say what the beast was. This vision, he's only going to see 2. He's going to see 2 animals, and it just represents the 2 middle kingdoms out of that previous vision that he's had. So he's getting a little more insight into something that he's already seen. We are in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, and one commentator said that's, it's a couple years after his first vision. It's shortly before the events of chapter 5. Belshazzar doesn't have much longer to live, and so we're not too interested in that first kingdom that's about to pass away already. We're jumping straight into the second kingdom, which is the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel sees that ram, and what is distinctive about this animal? What makes it noteworthy? It's lopsided horns, okay, and not only just that, but Daniel actually sees the horns grow, which is kind of weird. But we're seeing a vision or having a dream, and that weird stuff happens, right? So, so that's okay. But he sees the 2 horns come up, and one horn grows bigger than the other, and that represents what? Persian Empire was greater than the Mede Empire, even though the Median Empire was kind of the one that basically brought an end to the Babylonian Empire and launched things in that direction. Once the Persians take over, their kings were greater, their military was greater, their conquests were greater. Everything about Persia was bigger and better than Mede. So so we have the 2 horns, and the Persian horn is the bigger horn that is on that goat, or the ram, sorry. And what does he do? Yeah, what does the ram do? He butts his head to the north, to the south, to the west. And what did the Persian army do? It conquered the north, the west, and the south. Conquered Egypt to the south, conquered Armenia and parts of what we would call Turkey to the north, and even went as far as Greece under Xerxes. And so went all the way to the east, or to the west, and really had a disdain for the west. Went to the west and never did attack to the east. They did not try to advance their kingdom to the east. And historians debate that. They don't know why. Maybe it's just they liked the resources and the plundering better to the west, and so they went that way. Maybe they were afraid of those Mongol hordes to the east and didn't want to stir them up because they'd had bad luck with them in the past. So, there's various reasons why that may have happened. Or it could be because that's the direction God sent them. And maybe that's the one we'll stick with. So the Persians are represented by that bigger the horn, and the animal is doing what he does. And when he has accomplished all this, what does he do? Was the very last thing the ram does? Magnifies himself. Have we seen this happen before? And we're going to see it happen again. And it's kind of a common theme all the way through many of these earthly kingdoms, that God predicts, in fact establishes, and gives them their mission of what they're supposed to do in his sovereignty, and then they do what God has enabled them to do, and then they step back and say, look how great I am. And then they get humbled. And so we're going to see this theme over and over and over again. We've already seen it over and over again. We're going to continue to see it. So there is a lot of just foreshadowing here, not even foreshadowing, just plain telling, here's what's about to happen, and laying it all out specifically for how those things are going to write. So that kind of gets us through those verses. A couple of things, just some notes here on some commentators' things. Horns are a symbol in the Bible for power and authority, and so the fact that this that Daniel sees those horns grow, and they grow. First of all, one growing bigger represents the power of that one over the original one, but the fact that he sees them growing to a degree and to an extent that it's noteworthy speaks to the power that the kingdom itself was going to possess. And Persia certainly was a powerful kingdom for several hundred years on the world stage. And so it tracks with how that plays out. The ram, I've got some pictures, I think. The ram was actually a symbol of the Persian Empire, and their king wore instead of wearing like what we would think of as a crown, a king's crown, he actually wore a thing that was bejeweled or whatever with the ram's horns on it. That was his symbol of power for the Persian king. And so there's that. Other examples, this one is a bracelet from that dynasty or that era that somebody dug up somewhere that has ram's heads as part of the bracelets. And then here is, this is the extent of that Persian Empire at the heights of various rulers. So Cyrus II, which is 5, that's the Cyrus that we read about in Daniel in chapter 6, wasn't it? And then Cambyses, and then Darius the First. Darius is one that we'll read about later in the history. And so there's, I mean, you can see the extent of their empire and how far east they are to the west they actually were able to go. So Persia was a formidable kingdom. All right, verses 5 through 7 says, "While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power." All right, so where does this goat come from? Comes from the west. And what was to the west? Greece. And so we've already seen, a swift animal coming from the east. How was that swift animal represented in chapter 7 in that previous vision? Leopard, and not just a leopard, but a leopard with 4 wings, right? So it had a couple of sets of bird wings on him to even propel him faster. And so here we have this goat, and how do we know this goat is fast? Never touches the ground. Running so fast he never even touches the ground. And so he is advancing quickly across the empire that he is pursuing and that he is overtaking.
How far apart are we?
Esther would be King Xerxes, which was towards the end of the Persian Empire, and then Alexander the Great. In fact, it may have been Xerxes that was. There were a couple of Xerxes is the problem, and I'm not sure which one.
At that time frame, I know that there was a battle of the 300, the big famous battle.
Right, that was Esther's King Xerxes, and so and that is probably the fact that he led his army that far and actually attacked all the way into Greece, even though it was kind of a draw. They didn't really get to take over Greece, but they didn't really get ultimately defeated either. By the time Alexander comes along, he's heard that story and he hates the Persians. And one of the things that motivates him to drive all the way across the continent to take them out is the fact that he hates that they did that. Esther is before Alexander the Great. After Daniel, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Esther would be 150 years after Daniel. Yeah. 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 Persia stood as an empire for about 200 years. So Alexander the Great would have been 330s, I think, if I'm remembering right. And Daniel, this part of Daniel that we're seeing right now is like the 550s, 540s. So a couple hundred years before Alexander the Great. And those are, I'm going from memory there. I could be off by a couple of decades one way or the other. But all right. Let me see. I'm skipping over notes. I've got more notes than we'll get to. So this male goat, he comes from the west, and he's moving very, very fast. What is notable about how he's running, he didn't touch the ground, meaning he's moving really fast, and Alexander the Great took over. You know, he did basically all of his stuff within a decade. He had conquered, you know, the greatest army that was in existence at the time. What is remarkable about the appearance of the goat? Got one horn growing up, sounds more like a unicorn, growing up between his eyes. And so he's got one big horn growing up between his eyes, and that, you know, if we think about, this is one of those things where visions, they're kind of fluid and they shift and a little bit. So when we had the horns of the goat, of the ram, those horns represented kingdoms, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, and so that one big horn represented a couple hundred years of power, versus the one horn of the goat represents a person. So, but he only has a short reign. He doesn't last very long. So his kingdom is him, and so it kind of does represent a kingdom, but it really just represents one guy. And so, how does the goat defeat the ram? Knocks him down and tramples him, and nobody comes to his rescue. Can you believe that? An army that has dominated the world for a couple hundred years, that has been rather ruthless and merciless towards a lot of people, and he's getting throttled by a goat, and nobody comes to his rescue. Kind of makes sense, right? Especially when you see how vicious that goat is that's attacking him. Nobody wants to step in and try to stop that. And nobody has the power to stop it anyway. So let's see, came on the scene quick and powerful with astonishing speed. Daniel notes that the goat had a notable or conspicuous horn between his eyes. This horn is identified as the first king of Greece in verse 21, which, again, we're kind of taking the interpretation with the text as we read through it at first. Alexander the Great represents that notable horn. History confirms that Alexander's conquests were amazingly fast. Coincides with the description of Greece in chapter 7, where Greece is described as a leopard with wings on its back. Okay. There's an artist rendition of that lopsided goat's head with the one big horn, and here comes or ram, sorry, and then the goat with the one horn coming after him. Ferocious battle. All right. Verses 8 through 12. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven, and it caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. All right, that's pretty clear. We'll move on. Now, Chuck, I knew it'd be you. All right. So what does the goat do in his victory? Does what we've come to expect, magnifies himself, okay, and magnifies himself exceedingly. So, Alexander the Great did that very thing. He magnified himself exceedingly.
The reason why he didn't last very long was he was exhausted from this fast.
If he just slowed down a little bit, he'd been better rested, maybe so. He went so fast he got tired, but he magnifies himself. He sets himself up. He compares himself to God. He institutes king worship kind of thing, and doesn't last very long after that. God has a way of not putting up with those kind of things, and so that takes him out pretty quick. What happens to the horn and the other horns? The first one, representing Alexander the Great, breaks as soon as he's done using it, kind of thing. He kills the ram with it, and then he doesn't have very long before that one breaks off, and then what comes up in its place? 4 little horns, 4 smaller horns, and they kind of point where? To the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. And then what happens to those 4? They kind of disperse, and what comes up in their place? A little bitty horn. And what happens to that little bitty horn? It grows big, right? It grows, and again, the fact that Daniel is watching this take place and the fact that it grows to a notable degree is part of the vision. It's not like, oh, there's a little horn and then I saw it grow an inch. It's like, oh, there was a little horn sprung up and then, whoa, man, it got big. How'd that happen? What does that mean? So it's noticeable that the horn grows. And what do horns represent? Kingdoms, power. And so something that starts off with a little bit of power grows to attain greater power, is what that horn, that part of the vision represents. And so just kind of break some of this stuff down. All right, so the goat. Let's see, and some of this is quotes from different commentators and stuff. Denny Petrillo writes, "The emotions of the goat are fittingly given. He was filled with mighty wrath as he was enraged at the ram." And so why attack the ram so ferociously? Because he hated that ram. He had a pure hatred for it. The hatred that Alexander had for the Persians is well documented. The Persian king Darius had tried to convince Alexander's military captains with bribes, and had even tried to get some of Alexander's closest friends to assassinate him. When Alexander became aware of these plots by Darius and the Persians, he was filled with hatred and rage and would not stop until the Persian kingdom was destroyed. Even as the conflict grew, as it became clear that the Persians were going to not fare well in this conflict, they attempted to offer a treaty of peace, but Alexander rejected it, and he was not going to rest until the Persian Empire was destroyed. And eventually, Alexander convinced some of Darius's own people to betray him, and they assassinated Darius, and that's how the Persian part of the conflict ended. Homer Haley adds, "The conquest of the ram by the he-goat led the goat to magnify himself exceedingly. In the last year of his life, Alexander appeared to ask the Greek states to treat him as divine. The great horn then was broken, and in its place came up 4 notable horns toward the 4 winds of heaven, which were 4 smaller kingdoms." So let's talk about those 4 smaller kingdoms, those four horns that come up. So you'll notice some of the kingdoms are smaller than others. None of them are the full size of the kingdom that Alexander had conquered. He had conquered all the way, let's see, this? Okay, so if Greece is right here, and Philip of Macedon, there's Macedonia, that was Alexander the Great's father. So he led his army all the way across. He went down into Egypt and conquered Egypt, and then led it all the way across past Persia to the even a little bit further than Persia had ever conquered to the east. And so he took a much wider swath, much bigger area than Persia had ever conquered. And when he died, because he did not have an heir that was viable, his kingdom was divided. And down here in Egypt, we have the Ptolemies. Have you ever heard of them, the Ptolemies? If you've paid attention in, what was his name, in Ancient Civilizations at Freed Hardeman. I forget his name now, but I listened, and we talked about the Ptolemies. And you know one of the Ptolemies. You could say her name if I gave you a clue. There you go, Cleopatra. She was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt. After the Ptolemaic line ended with Cleopatra, and this big area here, this green area, was taken over by a guy named Seleucus, and so we have the Seleucid kingdom, or the Seleucid, however you say it. I don't know if it's a hard C or a soft C, but the Seleucids. took that area, and those are going to be the two that we're primarily interested in, because what's right there where those two kingdoms join up? Right there. What's there? That's Judah. That's Israel. That's the promised land right there. And so where those two kingdoms kind of border one another, there's going to be a lot of conflict between those two kingdoms that happens right there in the midst of our beloved Holy Land. Then those are the ones that really are going to kind of draw our interest out of this. And then there were two others. There was Lysimachus and Cassander took over those two kingdoms, those two smaller areas up there. And so those are the four kingdoms represented by those four horns. Let's see. Pride continues to be a recurring theme. It's going to be a big recurring theme as we move forward with that little horn. So what happens to the four horns? We talked about that. They break and the little horn arises. And let's see, how far did we read? We did read through 12. Okay, so what does that little horn do that is of concern to us? Okay, it magnifies itself, right? I mean, that's a common theme. This is the third time we've seen it. We saw it with the Persian. The ram magnified itself. Then Alexander the Great comes along and he kills the goat, or he kills the ram, and the goat magnifies himself, and he dies. And now we've got a small little horn grew up to be a big horn, and he magnifies himself. So we've got all these rulers that come along that exhibit this level of pride that is notable. It's not just like your average arrogance. It's like a level of pride that leads them to exalt themselves as divine, leads them to try to set themselves against the God of heaven, which is never a position you want to be in. So these are notable levels of arrogance and pride that we're talking about. There was another map that kind of shows some modern day countries as just for reference. You can go down a lot of really weird rabbit holes if you start looking up some of this stuff on the internet, because some people have some really, really weird ideas about what Daniel's vision meant. Instead of just taking the interpretation it gives in the Bible, they come up with their own interpretations, and they'll start pasting like United States flags over some of these things, and like we're one of the goats or something. I don't know. So, which is just weird to me that they would abandon what the Bible says about itself and try to impose their own understanding on it. And so, but I thought this was interesting just because it does show kind of, for historical purposes, what countries are involved as we would think of them today. What is the beautiful land? Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise. There's a land that has been part of God's promise to God's people for centuries, for generations at this point. And so for us to refer to a beautiful land would make sense for us to interpret it as the kind of the promised land, or as Israel. If you look at a couple of these verses, Jeremiah 3:19. Look how fast I can turn pages. All right. Then I said, how I would set you among my sons and give you a pleasant land, the most beautiful inheritance of the nations. And I said, you shall call me my father and not turn away from following me. So talking there in verse 18, it tells who he's talking to, the house of Judah and the house of Israel. So he's telling them that he would set them in the pleasant land with a beautiful inheritance, and that would be their land. And so it's been called that before, the beautiful land. And then if you look at Ezekiel chapter 20, and there are other passages too where we could look at that say very similar things, but Ezekiel 20 verses 6 and 15. Verse 6 says, on that day I swore to them to bring them out from the land of Egypt into a land that I had selected for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. And then again in verse 15, and I also swore to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into a land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. So it's the glory land, the beautiful land, the land of a beautiful inheritance. So that's the specific thing. So we're looking for then a ruler that fits the description of one who starts out with a little bit of power, becomes very powerful, magnifies himself, and has a special interest in the beautiful land, which is the promised land, but also which other directions are mentioned. Because it's not just the beautiful land in Daniel 8. Which way? South and east. So he's got a particular interest in the south, which would be Egypt, and in the east, which would be that portion. So we're talking about the ruler that is involved in that conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And so that kind of that zeroes it in for us of where we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody who was stationed in Athens, or we're not talking about somebody who was up further north in Turkey or Armenia or somewhere. We're talking about somebody who was in that region of the Promised Land, who was involved in conflict between the Ptolemies and Seleucids, who had a special level of arrogance that reared itself in relation to God's people. Okay, so can we find that person in history then? I think we can. So, so let's go there. All right. And I don't know that I have a bunch. What is significant about the little horn? That's kind of that whole little thing that we just went through. Sets the stage for who this person is and where they are and all that. So I don't have slides for this part, but I have a lot of notes for this part. So there are, of course, as I said a minute ago, there you can go down a lot of rabbit holes and you could read a lot of things that take you weird directions with some of this stuff. But basically, within the realm of commentators and people that we would read and find reasonable, there's pretty well consensus on who this is. And there's a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes who reigned from 175 to 164 BC. And he was of the Seleucid dynasty. So he came out of that dynasty, but he also had, there was a lot of intrigue. He tried to unite with the Ptolemies, and then when that didn't happen, he tried to overtake the Ptolemies. But by then, Rome was kind of already on the scene, and Rome, you heard of Mark Antony and who? Cleopatra, right? And so we have that kind of that union between Rome and the Ptolemies already starting to take its place. So when Antiochus Epiphanes wants to finally go to battle with the Ptolemies, he's got an army from Rome that kind of keeps that from happening. So there's, this kind of fits into that whole realm of intrigue for that area and fits with kind of the historical setting of that time. The horn, let's see, Antiochus IV was both the most interesting and the most erratic of his line, a rare mixture of intellect, insanity, and charm. Nobody wants to say who that reminds him of today? No? Okay, all right. I'm not going there. All right. A rare mixture of intellect, insanity, and charm. He governed his kingdom ably despite 1,000 injustices and absurdities. He allowed his delegates to abuse their power. He gave his mistress authority over 3 cities. He was generous and cruel, often forgiving or condemning by whim, surprising simple folk with costly gifts, tossing money with a child's ecstasy among the crowds in the street. He loved wine, women, and art. He drank to excess and left his royal seat at banquets to dance naked with the entertainers or to carouse with the poor people. I mean, that's Antiochus Epiphanes. So that's the little horn that starts off as being an insignificant person, but then somehow through his absurdities and through his intricacies and through his cruelty and through his shrewdness, positions himself to be a person of historical significance. And that's what he does. Verse 10, Antiochus Epiphanes receives special attention here in verse 10 because of the role that he played with God's people. His focus on the Jews and with regard to the land of Israel was legendary. Antiochus, having been limited by the Romans in his desire to conquer Egypt, turned his fury toward the land of Israel. God's people here are described as the host of heaven. This imagery refers to the people of God, those who are faithful and loyal to God's covenant. Antiochus grew so large that in this figure he was able to reach into the stars, which is symbolic or figurative for God's people, and pull some of them down. And by using imagery, we see that Antiochus' attack was actually against the God of heaven himself, and the fact that he trampled them indicates severe persecution. So he unleashed fury on God's people because he didn't get to go unleash fury on Egypt, which is really what he really wanted to do, but he couldn't, so he had to unleash his fury on someone. This is going to be a good one, I can add.
We've got the
Maccabees.
Maccabees period.
Yes.
So is
This is that. This is right then. In fact,
something about sacrificing a pig on the altar or something?
yes,
Is this
absolutely.
part of
Yep.
what he did?
You're jumping all over it. I thought I had it open. I may have been looking on my computer. I thought I had it open on my phone because I was going to read there anyway. If you, under Bible Gateway, choose the New Catholic Bible as your Bible, you can look up First Maccabees, because our Bibles don't have those books, but Catholic Bibles have books that our Bibles don't have. So, so if you look up first, and I read a little bit, made me want to read more, to be honest with you. Maccabees, see if I spelled it right. Chapter 1. First Maccabees chapter 1. Starting in verse 41, and if you back up a ways, it names Antiochus as the king. If you back up a ways, and I'm in First Maccabees now, which is, I know, is probably the first time that's ever been done, standing up here, that somebody's reading from First Maccabees, but it's okay. If you back up to verse 16, First Maccabees 1:16 talks about Antiochus was determined to become king of Egypt so that he might reign over both kingdoms. He invaded Egypt, and it was not good. So, and then you jump all the way down to verse 41, and it says, "Then the king issued an edict to his whole kingdom that all of his subjects should become a united people, with each nation abandoning its particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the decree of the king, and many among the Israelites adopted his religion, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. The king also sent messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah with edicts, commanding them to adopt practices that were foreign to their country, to prohibit holocausts, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and feast days, to defile the temple and its priests, to build altars, temples, and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean beasts, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to allow themselves to be defiled with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they would forget the law and change all their observances. Anyone who refused to obey the command of the king was to be put to death." So that's from an ancient document for sure, from the book of First Maccabees that describes Antiochus' reign after his attempt to conquer Egypt was thwarted. And what did he do? He unleashed fury on his subjects, the people of the Promised Land, and he told them that they had to forego their customs and beliefs, give up their gods, and serve whatever he said they needed to serve. And when they refused, he sentenced them to death. And there are other histories and mentions of times when he put massive numbers of people to death. One account says he slaughtered 80,000 people, and that included women, children, infants, all of that. So he just decimated entire regions of his own country because he wanted to go to battle, but they wouldn't let him. So he had to take it out on somebody. And that actually is, if Second Maccabees chapter 5 talks about that slaughter of 80,000 men, women, and children during an attack upon Jerusalem. So I've kind of jumped all over in my notes here. Let me make sure I'm not leaving something out. He felt that he himself was greater than the God of the Jews and considered the Greek gods to be superior to the Jewish God as well.
It says he built a statue of Zeus on the altar.
That's one that we'll get down to, that is when we start talking about some of the timing stuff here in a minute, about how that all sorts itself out. Yes. Some of my notes overlap with things that we'll get to in just a minute. So during this time of the persecution, verse 12, on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. So there's actually the host, remember, represents God's people, and he kind of puts himself amongst them and he tears some of them down. Well, some of them go willingly. And so some of them are counted not as the victims, but as the perpetrators along with him, because they go willingly into sin. And so in verse 12, it says, commentator says, the transgression refers not to that done by Antiochus, but to that done by the Jews. During this time of persecution, many abandoned their relationship with God and openly embraced the idolatrous religion of Antiochus. Therefore, the army, that is God's people, were given over to Antiochus, along with the religious activities that had been done daily. So through the acts of Antiochus and the subsequent following of the Jews, the truth suffered and the lies about Antiochus prospered. According to 1 Maccabees 1, 56 and 57, the books of the law which they found, they tore to pieces, they burned with fire. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of any one, or if anyone adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned him to death. So that's the little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. He fits the things that the little horn did, that Daniel envisioned. It fits historically in with kind of the timing of things coming towards the end of this reign of the four horns before the Roman Empire is able to solidify itself as the single dominant empire in the world at that point. They're on the rise, but they're not all the way there yet. So we don't have the next beast coming into the picture, although it is coming. It's coming into its own. It fits geographically with the beautiful land. It just fits all along the way. Fits historically, it fits geographically, it fits thematically with the things that were done. So to me, it kind of fits. It just works. So I think we found our little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. But if you disagree, I'll listen to what you have to say. Yeah.
Is he setting himself up to be God as great as the prince of the host? Is that?
Yes. He did consider himself to be. He felt that he himself was greater than the God of the Jews. And that was, that's established, that he believed himself to be divine. Okay, well, let's see what else we can discover here. Verses 13 and 14. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? He said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. That clears it up. So what is revealed by the Holy One who speaks? Something about the timing of these things, okay? And so, so how long is this going to last? This debauchery, this reign of terror by Antiochus Epiphanes, how long is that going to go on for? 2,300 evenings and mornings. Okay, so how many possible interpretations do you think there are for this? At least 4. It could, there's a couple, and there's 2 of them that I think are just out. No, that are just out. One, the first, I'll start with the one that I think is most irrelevant, most outlandish. Some have suggested it refers to 2,300 years, and they're trying to make the end of this reign of terror coincide with the return of Christ. And so, what's one immediate problem you see with that? Well, we don't know the time, and we're not really ever given anything in the Bible to help us narrow down that time to a specific degree. But how many years has it been since Antiochus Epiphanes was around? More than 2,300 years. So, unless we're willing to forgo Antiochus Epiphanes being this and launch that into something else, and then try to predict when the 2,300 years ends and go back and find somebody that fits that, we're in a little bit of trouble. So I don't think there's any indication in the text, in Daniel's vision, in the interpretation of the vision that we're given later on in the chapter, in any way, shape, or form to make us think that this is telling us about the return of Christ as being the fulfillment of what Daniel's vision is. I don't see it in there. I don't find room for it anywhere. I don't see room even for some sort of double fulfillment where some people try to say, well, yeah, Daniel had something that mattered for his people, but he also had something that comes later in that matters to Christians, and this, so there's a double fulfillment to this. I don't see any of that. I don't find room for it anywhere in the text. So 2,300 years for me is out. I don't think that can be it. 2,300 could be 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices, because what does it say? It says until 2,300 evenings and mornings. And so, again, this one for me causes, I can see why they go there, but there's no, other than when it talks about having evening and morning sacrifices, which is specifically what it's talking about when it's going through the law, there's never a time when time is measured as a morning and an evening, and it means, and you have to chop that number in half for the number of days. Anytime, if I say 40 days and 40 nights, how long did it rain? It rained 40 days, right? 40 total days. It didn't rain 20, because we say days and nights, you cut it in half. When Jesus was, when 3 days and 3 nights, how many was that? It wasn't a day and a half, it was 3 days and 3 nights. So when we have the measure of time in the Bible given as days and nights or evenings and mornings, it's days. It's that total number. It's not, we're not going to cut it in half. And so there's some, they kind of go into that idea of it being half that number, and they try to make it line up with from the time that Antiochus Epiphanes put the goat, or killed the pig on the altar, to the time that the Maccabees restored the sacrifice, cleansed the altar, and did that what they needed to do. So, but the problem there is it doesn't line up right. We know pretty well when the date was. It was in December of the year I've lost it. It was in December that he sacrificed the pig, and then we know the exact date of when it was cleansed, and that's not a year and a half. That's not three and a half. It's not the right number of years and months for it to be 1,500 days. 6 years and 4 months would be 2,300 days, and if you cut that in half, it'd be 3 years and 2 months. So, it's not. It doesn't fit up right. It doesn't match, and you have to kind of do some cartwheels to get some things to match up right for it to be the 1,500, or the whatever it would be. If you cut it in half, 1,150. Okay, so then the two that I think are more likely would be one, first of all, it's just days, 2,300 days. And we'll talk about that one. And then the other one is that it's a figurative number. It's not supposed to be a literal 2,300 something that we count and check it off the calendar, and when we hit 2,300, we're done. But it just represents a prophetic amount of time that is short of 7 years. Why would we want it to be short of 7 years? What is 7 in figurative stuff? It's complete. It's totality. Seven means we've done it all the way. And so if Antiochus Epiphanes establishes that he can get rid of God for 7 complete years, he's succeeded. He's done what he set out to do. But if he falls short of that number, then he's proven himself to be weak and worthless, which is what he was. So that one has some appeal. I like that it doesn't force us into counting days on a calendar. It doesn't force us into trying to establish exact dates that something happens so that we can count 2,300 days. But then 2,300 is not a typical prophetic number either, so it's kind of weird there. But if it's supposed to be short of the perfect number, then it works. So the other one, and the one that Denny Petrillo goes with, and I've liked his commentary, and McGuigan as well, supports it being the idea of 2,300 days. That's the view expressed in Greek versions. It's the Latin Vulgate, King James, New King James, that it's a specific time reference, that it's a specific time reference. Oh, the other thing that people that want it to be 2,300, sorry, I'm backing up a little bit. The ones that want it to be 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices, so they cut that number in half. They're really trying to get that to line up with that question Chuck asked last week that I'm not going to talk about right now, but the times and a half time. They want that to be 3.5 years, and if they can get this to 1,150 days, they can almost make that be 3.5 years, even though it's not quite right. They're trying really hard to get those to line up, even though I would say they really don't have anything to do with one another. But we'll talk about that one later when it comes back up. Let's see. This number would represent approximately 6 years and 4 months. Considering this number, that it falls short of 7 years. All right. I'm trying to find the part where it talks about the dates of some things that happen. So if you go back and look at, oh, there it is. In December of 164, the reconstruction of the sanctuary. That's when the desecration ends. So if we mark back from there, go back 6 years and 4 months, something significant must have occurred at that time. And if you go back to 170 BC, which would be 6 years, we're counting backwards because it's BC. So if you go back to 170, there was a high priest named Onias III, who was struggling against Antiochus Epiphanes, trying to keep the people to be faithful. Onias was a good guy, by all reckonings, and he was assassinated. He was murdered at the behest of Antiochus Epiphanes. So if you mark from his murder to the reconstruction of the temple and the cleansing of the temple by the Maccabees, then you have that 6 year and 4 month period. It works out to 2,300 days. We get it in there. It works out okay. So the altar to Zeus was set up in 167, and a pig was sacrificed on that altar in December of 167. And so if you go to 164, then you have 3 years, but it's not the right number of months. It's almost exactly 3 years, and that you're left over with 2 months that don't work. So that's one of the problems there. All right. I feel like I've rambled. I should have had some flow charts or something up on this so that you could at least see some dates or something, but I'm happy to share notes with anybody who wants to see them if you want to see what I've got. Holy smokes, it's 5 after. Okay, sorry about that. We'll start with verse 15 next week. I didn't even know you got up, Chuck. Sorry. You should have flagged me down, man. I was waxing elephants.